I would like to introduce our speaker today. Comes to us, he was referred to me by Father Adam Mallman of the St. Charles Borromeo Catholic Church in Peru. And he told me of this young man by the name of Stephen O'Keefe, who lives in Carmel, a lifelong Catholic layman, graduating from Purdue with a degree in engineering. He now works in Indianapolis as a mechanical engineer. He lives in Westfield with his wife and 3 boys. Since 2009, Stephen has been a volunteer youth catechist, a pro-life speaker, blogger, and presenter at Our Lady of Mount Carmel Parish in Carmel. So with those words, I welcome you, my friend, to our lecture series and await your presentation. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you guys for coming here today. I want to thank you, Pastor Tom, especially for putting this on and for entrusting this lecture to an uncredentialed layman whose only qualification is that he likes to talk. Some of you might be wondering what exactly is a Catholic doing at a Reformation celebration. Big elephant in the room is that, of course, as far as interacting with this period of history, we are, so to speak, on the other side. And so as such, I'm sort of destined to be the official party pooper. And poop I shall, but hopefully in a way which is both ironic and informative. I hope that things that I say today will maybe challenge you a little bit. I hope that if you are not a Catholic, that you expect me to say things which are challenging. That if you walked out of here utterly comfortable with everything I said, that you'd be in some ways disappointed with me. And that feeling as if you did not get your time's worth. So, speak up a little bit, he says. I shall endeavor to do that. Okay, and so let's get started. By way of introduction, again, I was born in Massachusetts and came out here to Indiana when I was a wee lad back in 1991. Very grateful to my parents for having done that. I went to Purdue. I'm reading the slide like I don't know my own history. I went to Purdue and graduated in 2008 with a mechanical engineering degree. And yes, when I returned back to Westfield, I encountered some of my old youth ministers who gave me a Bible study and insisted that I teach it because I was the new kid out of college and maybe the kids would listen to me. And when they did that, I realized I had to get smart and learn a few things, and hopefully I've been a positive influence there. I met my wife at a Bible study at Purdue. That was by design. It's why I was there. I don't make any bones about it. If someone asked me why I was there, I would have said, well, to meet my wife and maybe learn a few things about the Bible. We were married in 2010, and we now have 3 wonderful young boys, James, Fulton, and Andrew. And yep, that's James, Fulton, and there's little baby Andrew. I was going to do this for real, but sometimes I'll start off with a little trivia contest. I'll say to the kids, or I say kids because I generally talk to kids, sorry. I'll say to if I'm giving a pro-life lecture, I'll say, all right, so my son was born in February, at the end of February, February 28th. And now we are at the end of October. How old is he? Right? And so people will start doing the numbers in their head. And then someone's hand will raise and they'll say, well, he's 8 months old. And I'll say, great, wrong. Then people look confused. 7? Nope. 9? Nope. And then someone will raise his hand and say, he is 16 months old. And I'll say, aha, you are the pro-life person in the room. Every other person assumed that life began at birth, which is not what we believe. And so that's a little brain teaser I'd like to start off with. And hopefully every hand in the room would have said 16 months. I'm sure of that. Okay, so we're here to talk about the event known as the Protestant Reformation. We live in the wake of the Protestant Reformation every day. Every time we get up and go to church, every time we talk to one of our Christian neighbor, we are living in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. It's an important period of time, and studying it, as we should, invites questions such as, what exactly was the church after? What were the issues that were being discussed? And why were the responses on both sides what they were? And who were these people who were involved? And so today we're going to be discussing a little bit of that. I want to start with kind of a funny story. This is a true story from the Napoleonic era, where Napoleon had cornered the Archbishop of Paris, Ercole Consalvi, and threatened him, saying, "Do you not know that I could destroy the Catholic Church?" And the good bishop replied to him, "Your Majesty, we, the Catholic clergy, have done our best to destroy the church for the last 1,800 years. We have not succeeded, and neither will you." And those prophetic words ended up being quite correct. And I love the humor in that, but I also love the truth in it, because as a Catholic, you do view the church as a divine institution which does not rest on the strength or the wisdom of its clergy, which is frequently lacking, but rather it's God's providence that keeps the boat afloat. In many cases, in spite of its own leadership. And indeed, we're going to be talking a little bit about that. So first, I wanted to set the stage by talking about some of the people who came before 1517, before Wittenberg. This is an important background to get the idea of what things might have been like as we enter into this period of history. So we're going to start with a Catholic laywoman by the name of St. Catherine of Siena. She was a Catholic laywoman who, oddly enough, wanted to stay that way. She did not want to marry. She did not want to join a convent. And she wanted basically to live a pious life in service to the poor and in service to the church. And eventually she prevailed upon her parents. The stories there are kind of hilarious. It involves, cutting her hair and trying to make herself as unattractive as possible so no suitor would take her. But eventually she prevailed upon her parents to let her remain single and to not join a convent. And she basically became something like a Mother Teresa of that period of time. I'm sure that everyone here knows that name, Mother Teresa. She became world-renowned for her piety and for her service to the poor and for her holiness. And people of high rank would seek her moral influence in trying to state their cases to other people. You wanted this woman on your side. And the most celebrated instance of that is when she went to Avignon, France, to go see Pope Gregory XI. And at that point in time, the popes had moved to Avignon, France, the more stylish metropolitan area where they were able to live in a much more friendly and luxurious place. And she went to Pope Gregory XI and told him to get his butt back home. He's the Bishop of Rome. Start acting like it. When Mother Teresa starts talking to you like that, you move. And so if you can imagine if you're getting a lecture from Mother Teresa, that's what it was like. So he headed home. Our next person is Thomas à Kempis. Thomas à Kempis was basically just a good Catholic clergyman from Kempen, Germany. His most notable contribution is a work called The Imitation of Christ. At the time, it was a bestseller in the I can't remember if yes, he wrote it after the printing press. So it was one of the first bestsellers, if such a thing could have existed at that time. And it was basically a manual for all Catholics, lay or in clergy, a guide to the devotional life. And it advised them on how to grow in their relationship with God by removing all distractions from their life and seeking out quiet and prayer and getting away from worldliness. And it tried to teach them how to reflect on the sacraments and how to receive them with more reverence and devotion. And again, this was a big bestseller at the time, and whole communities of lay people would gather around this book to study it and try to implement it in their lives. Next, we're going to move to a more sad story. This is Girolamo. Oh, I even wrote it out here. Girolamo Savonarola. Italian, that's what you're going to do. His story, he was a Dominican preacher during the late 15th century, and he was a reformer. He wanted to reform the Dominican order, which had grown kind of stodgy and corrupt and perfunctory. And he spoke out against the worldliness in his own order, and especially the worldliness that was on display in Florence, Italy. And he also spoke out against the corruption and worldliness among the Curia in the Vatican. He became enormously popular for having done so. He was a very popular preacher for pointing out these widespread abuses. Unfortunately, you can only make the rich Florentines irate for so long. They tried to get him on basically trumped-up charges, and his response to those charges was he didn't help himself. He basically did not handle those very well. He was summoned to Rome by Pope Alexander IV, who is not recognized as a very good pope. He's actually at the bottom of the list as far as good popes go. But from my reading, Pope Alexander really had no interest in the man whatsoever, and was just honestly hoping that he would, he could just be ignored. But these Florentine rich people weren't letting him be ignored. And Girolamo's response to these false accusations did not help him. He went into a state of disobedience, started making people even more mad on purpose, and eventually those false charges ended up costing him his life. But the point of why I bring him up is that he was enormously popular for bringing up the abuses and such that he did. Which brings us to a very good bishop out in Spain, Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros. He was a very good bishop, and he donated most of his income to serve the poor and to rescue captives, because at that point in time, shipping lanes were marauded by Muslim pirates. If you remember what's the Marine song, From the Shore to the Shores of Tripoli, right? That's what that song is talking about there. Anyways, he was very concerned about the state of the education in his diocese, and he ended up founding the University of Alcalá in Henares. And he also personally funded the printing and distribution of a multi-language Bible. And he also, at the time, recognized there were some problems going on with the Spanish Inquisition, which I'm sure you're all at least familiar with that name, and he was trying to reform that and make sure that a more just proceeding was taking place. Which brings us on the last step before we get to Wittenberg here, is Pope Julius II and the Fifth Lateran Council. Pope Julius was elected with a mandate for reform, which everyone knew was necessary at this point, and so he called the Fifth Lateran Council in 1512 and ended in 1517. It was an attempt to reform the church. It was not a very good attempt. If you go back and read through the documents, they were mostly about inter-church or intra-church politics. And there was some sections there about the trying to curb the sin of simony, which is the trafficking in religious goods for money. There was an attempt to try to address that, but this council was largely regarded as being too little and not much implementation and not very successful by any measure. But I bring it up simply because I want to tell you that the church was aware that reform was necessary at this point, even if it found itself really incapable of pulling off those reforms, and it couldn't muster up the willpower to do it. I went to public schools, and the version of history that I got was something like this. Prior to 1517, the church was in a Babylonian captivity, and personal discipleship was dead. And Bibles collected dust under pews, and no one read them. And personal discipleship was gone, and all the clergy was corrupt, and Martin Luther was the first and only guy who managed to stand up and show everyone that things need to change, and he was a great guiding light that had never been seen before. And the reality is far more nuanced. Only a fool would diminish his importance to the event known as the Protestant Reformation. But what I'm trying to get to you is that personal discipleship wasn't dead. The clergy were in an utter mess at that point. There were lots and lots of problems, but they were known to the church even if it found itself unwilling to muster the willpower to do anything about it. Reform was necessary. Which brings us to the event in question. Names are important. Names are very important. They shape the way that we think about events and people and things. So, for instance, in 2009, we got the Affordable Care and Patient Protection Act. What a lovely name. If they named it the Stephen O'Keefe Loses $5,000 a Year in Lost Income Act, it wouldn't have passed as much. That's what happened. Yeah, it would not have sailed through like it did. But oh gosh, that name. And I've had people say to me, how could you be against affordable care? Look at the name. And I'm like, but that is to say, names matter, and what we call things matter. And again, this applies to historical events as well. It's why certain Southern polemicists would rather call it the War for Southern Independence or the War of Northern Aggression. If you've ever heard that being called. Honestly, as an aside, I actually think the War for Southern Independence is actually really descriptive. I would go with that one if that was in the history books, but we call it the Civil War. That's an aside. But names matter. Names matter. What we call things matter. And it shapes the way that we approach things. So let's talk about the word reform. Reform, a good practical definition of the thing, as this kind kitten would tell us, is a program of change in an individual or body aimed at addressing and resolving problems. Okay, so if you think about some for instances, so if you reform medical insurance or medical malpractice law, one set of rules before, another set after. Right? You've reformed it. You've tried to eliminate possibilities of frivolous lawsuits, so you have a new set of rules, one before, one after. Right? Or you imagine a reform of the Academy of Motion Pictures, so that the organization is trying to get rid of bribery. They're going to have to try to, do more on focusing on performance and writing and so on, as opposed to who can put on the best gala dinner. Right? So you reform the Academy of Motion Pictures. Reform has a positive connotation. We think of it as the thing that solved the problems. Right? So we say the alcoholic reformed his life. Well, no one wonders if that was a change for the good or not. We recognize that, yes, he reformed his life. He's kicked the bottle and now things are fixed. As a Catholic, you approach the phrase Protestant Reformation, and as those words come out of your mouth, when you call that event the reform, you're saying implicitly that was the program of change that solved the problems, because that's what the word reform means. So, if you notice, throughout this presentation so far, I've said things like the event known as the Protestant Reformation, because that's what it's known as. But as a Catholic myself, I prefer not to say that term, because in a way it's admitting, it's basically giving up to saying, yes, they were right. Which if you're a Catholic, you're like, well, if I thought they were right, I wouldn't be a Catholic. I would go I would go be something else. So as a Catholic, this is not a term that I like to use. Maybe you think that's just sour grapes, by the way, and perhaps it is. Perhaps that is sour grapes. But I think there's actually some other historical reasons why that label might not pertain. First thing is, the moment you start studying the Protestant Reformation, you have to start breaking it down regionally. There's the English Reformation, the German Reformation, the Swiss Reformation, and a bunch of other tinier ones besides. It's almost as if you had a lecture series about this period of time, you would have to break it up week by week so that everyone could have their say. A little meta joke there. So the singularity of the thing is actually part of the marketing, to use an anachronistic phrase. It wasn't actually a single cohesive movement. It wasn't a single program of change. We're talking about a series of independent, there was certainly communication between them, but these were autonomous movements, which ended up in different directions and had results which were in some cases mutually contradictory to one another. So it seems to me that it would be appropriate to even just call, even if I wanted to grant the word Reformation, I would almost want to pluralize it and say it's the Protestant Reformations. But then there's the biggest question of all, was this a Reformation at all? Well, Luther's 95 Theses was absolutely a reformational document. It was a document written by a Catholic priest to other Catholic priests, and he had 95 points about what he wanted to change within the Catholic polity. Honestly, it was really about 12 changes. There was a lot of repetition in 95 Theses. But anyways, he had a program of change he wanted to institute, and he wanted to institute it explicitly in communion with the Pope. He said this 4 times in the document. He wanted to initiate a change in the church in communion with the Pope. All right, so that was a genuine reformational document. But what happened when his reform was rejected and he started encountering opposition? Well, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, this is from the Reformation in Germany, this drive from below, further nourished by traditional anti-clerical sentiments, was met from above by eagerness of territorial and urban governments to utilize the Lutheran ideas as legitimation for the extension of political control of the church. Thus, by the 1520s, a number of German cities and states had formally turned Lutheran, meaning that they had severed legal ties and administrative ties to Rome and its prelates and were building new ecclesial institutions and framing new doctrines. That's from Germany. The same happened elsewhere. This was from Sweden. When Hoffmann left the city, opposition from pastors hostile to the Reformation broke down. The Bishop of Constance tried to intervene in defending the Mass and the veneration of images. Zwingli wrote an official response for the council, and the result was the severance of all ties between the city and the diocese. That is something that we have when you remove an existing institutional authority and replace it with a new one. We have a different word in English for that. It's called revolution. And so, even as a lover of English, I have to look at what occurred and I say, well, that's, if I call it Reformation, I'm like, well, when you toss out the existing clergy and you replace them with your own, that's like, that's as much of Thomas Jefferson did not reform the English government. Can we agree to that? The event which occurred in 1776, we do not call it the Great Reform of the English government. There's nothing pejorative about the word revolution, but I find it to be more accurate to what the event is that we're describing. And so as a Catholic, what I see is a series of religious political revolutions spread across Northern Europe. And on the more neutral side, I prefer to call it, when I'm being, PC, I prefer to call it the Protestant movement, the Protestant era, or the Protestant leaders. That's pretty non-judgmental. But then if I'm speaking in-house, a little bit of inside baseball here, I will say, the Protestant revolutions and the Protestant revolutionaries. And that, I find, is a very accurate way of stating it. But again, reform was necessary. Everyone knows reform is necessary. And so as a Catholic, I would view the following as the reform: the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent replied to the theological assertions of the Protestant leaders. There I am using the PC term there. It clarified Catholic teaching on just about everything, and it also addressed the various abuses that were going on in the church. Regarding salvation, that is, of course, something which is near and dear to everyone's heart. It is one of the most practical subjects that you could ever possibly study, because it will affect a very long period of time, which all of us will approach at one point or another. The Catholic perspective on salvation is often presented like this. Here we go. God gives you faith, and you do good works, and together those two mix together in sort of a blender and give you justification and salvation. As a Catholic, you get used to people kind of confronting you with this schema, saying, this is what you Catholics believe, and here's why it's wrong. Now what happens is, many times, almost all the time, Catholics will assume that, okay, well, then this is what we believe, and this is what I must defend. And so you'll find Catholics defending this. And I was one of them for a very long period of time. And one day, after a session of trying to defend this, I kind of said to myself, this is really hard to defend. Like, this is a real chore. I'm not even sure if I understand it. So I said to myself, well, I'm going to go ahead and what exactly did the medieval fathers of the Council of Trent have to say about this? How did they rationalize this thing? And so I read the Council of Trent, session 6, and then I read the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I think it's, ironically enough, around paragraph 1600. Thank you to whoever it was that got the irony there. And I found the oddest thing. This isn't what the Church teaches. This doesn't even count as a parody of what the Church teaches. To use the modern term, this is fake news. This is fake news. This is fake news. This ain't it. All right, and that was a great revelation for me to find out that years of trying to defend this were utterly wasted because it wasn't even what we believed. And the other thing is that every refutation of Catholic teaching that I've ever read refutes this, and that includes the Book of Concord, which I've read. It refutes this. So, having built that up, what exactly does the church say? Well, you go to session 6 of Trent, it tells you the following. And off the screen here I have little citations. Not that anyone's taking notes, but you can email me later on if you like. Session 6 of Trent, what does it say? It's on the prior to faith, a person has no merit before God. It describes you as a child of wrath, using the term from Ephesians chapter 2. It taught that salvation is entirely a work of God's grace, which is entirely merited by Christ's action on the cross. And then it said that salvation is received freely by faith in the sacrament of baptism. And no good works are necessary. So, how do you move from being an unsaved pagan to being a saved Christian, according to the Session 6 of the Council of Trent? Repent, believe, and be baptized. That's it. No good works necessary. You don't need to do a bunch of good things to be forgiven of your sins. You just have to submit yourself to baptism and desire it. It condemned Pelagianism. Pelagianism is the belief that is an early 5th century heresy, which said that it basically denied original sin and said that you just have to pull yourself up by your moral bootstraps. It's basically like, grace is good for the weak. But if you're really awesome, you'll pull yourself by your own moral bootstraps. You'll avoid sin entirely and do a bunch of good works, and you'll show up at the gates of heaven and say, I earned this. That's Pelagianism. So it condemned that. That was the first hand that it gave, was it condemned Pelagianism. It said that, no, you can't work your way into heaven. That's ridiculous. And then it went ahead and condemned this thing called semi-Pelagianism. Semi-Pelagianism is the belief that your conversion, your decision, so to speak, for God and Christ, is not a work of grace. It was trying to solve some of the thorny mysteries involving predestination, grace, and free will. That's really is the most thorny issue in Christian theology. A lot of weird things happen the more you explore that area. And so what it did was it condemned semi-Pelagianism. Again, it said semi-Pelagianism was you come to God through the force of your own free will, and after that grace takes over. And so what it said was, no, you can't believe God, you can't want the good without grace. St. Thomas Aquinas, in his treatise on grace, actually proposed that you can't even do geometry problems without grace. Literally, he said that. Then it had to turn around to the other side of the room and issue some statements about the more modern controversies. So it condemned the idea that human free will isn't at all involved in conversion. So on the one side it says, if you say that it's only human free will, you've crossed off the median in one direction. But then it says, if you deny any role for human free will, you've crossed off the highway in the other direction. And the reason why is because if you deny any role of human free will in salvation, you just have to follow that train of thought a few steps, and you wind up with the idea that God doesn't want everyone to be saved, and he can sign some people to hell, and he really, really doesn't want some people in heaven, and that Jesus didn't die for everyone. You are given those conclusions on a silver platter. As soon as you deny any role of free will, that's where you go. And so you can't go there. In Trent Session 6, Canon 5, condemns that idea. But then it also condemns certain understandings of the phrase faith alone. I put that there in italics for good reason. Is because when you read the thing, it doesn't actually just say, faith alone condemned. Right? What it says is, if a man saith that the impious is justified by faith alone, such wise as to mean, comma, and then it describes what they mean, and it says, if you mean that, no. Right? So it didn't condemn any and every understanding of the phrase faith alone, just a certain one, namely one which describes saving faith in a manner which leaves out the role of repentance. If you leave that out, bad things happen. There's this idea called antinomianism. I don't know if everyone knows what that word means, but antinomianism means that as long as you believe, and as long as you believe and trust and have faith, that your moral quality of your life is utterly irrelevant to the state of your salvation, such wise that you can do anything you like as long as you have faith. Now, of course, no Christian confession really endorses that idea, but what happens is as soon as if you get rid of repentance from your understanding of true justifying faith, you may want to say no to antinomianism. The one thing you can't do is explain why. I hope you guys see that distinction there. You would see antinomianism. You'd want to say, no, you can't do that. But as soon as the person says why, you're at a dead end. And so those versions of the phrase faith alone had to be condemned. However, not all understandings of the phrase faith alone are condemned. This is Pope Benedict, a personal hero of mine, in November 19th, 2008, said the following. For this, I wish I could do a German accent. I wish I could do a Bavarian accent for you right now to make this genuine. But he said, for this reason, Luther's phrase, faith alone, they put Z's instead of TH's. I know that about Bavaria. Anyways, for this reason, Luther's phrase, faith alone, is true if it is not opposed to faith and charity and love. Faith is looking at Christ and trusting oneself to Christ, being united to Christ, conformed to Christ, to his life. And the form, the life of Christ, is love. Hence, to believe is to conform to Christ and to enter into his love. So, faith alone is not condemned as such, just certain understandings of it. So, a true justifying faith, according to the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church, the Catholic Catechism, looks like this. You have a true living faith. It's kind of composed of, not kind of composed, it is composed of faith, hope, and love. That is what a true justifying faith looks like. You subtract any one of these and you have a huge problem. Subtract faith and well, you're not a Christian anymore. Subtract hope and you've despaired, and now you've taken the root of Judas. Subtract charity and now you're an antinomian. As James says, even the demons tremble. So that's what a true justifying faith looks like. That's what you were given by God through grace. That's the real teaching of the Catholic Church on salvation. Where do good works come in? Well, good works flow from God's love poured into your heart. They are part of our sanctification. The Council refers to this as an increase in justice. You have to translate it out of medieval Catholicese, but what it means is sanctification. So our good works, done in Christ, done in faith, are pleasing to God, and they help us grow in our relationship to God, which hopefully you guys have experienced through your own experience. If you've ever done some great charitable work, you come out feeling closer to God, and that's by design. That's something that is a true facet of the Christian faith. But that is where good works come into this thing, is in our sanctification. On to the reforms. So section 21. By the way, if you ever try to look at all the reforms of the Council of Trent, it's in size 10 font. It goes on for 100 pages. I'm glad that I was last, so I had enough time to do that. But yeah, it goes on. So these bullet points are the high points, right? So section 21 eliminated the position of paid indulgence preachers. I think that a previous speaker mentioned Johannes Tetzel, the famous seller of indulgences. His position was removed. Basically, they said that we can't even have people doing this job anymore. Not just people, not even trying to reform the job. That's what the Fifth Lateran Council did, tried to reform the job. And at Trent, they basically said this job is utterly unreformable. We nix it. It's gone. It also amended how clergy are paid. Section 22 assigned punishments for people who abuse church property. So tried to use it as their personal, apartment and stuff. This was going on. Section 23, it said that a bishop isn't allowed to leave his diocese for more than 3 months. That was addressing the Avignon papacy. It basically says, no, you have to stay in your diocese. You're the bishop of that area, so stay there. All ordained persons are assigned to a church. What happened sometimes was a person be ordained so he could get on the dole, and then he basically had his check cut every month and he didn't have to do anything. So So Trent basically said, no, you can't do that. If you're going to be a cleric, you have to be a cleric. It prevented clerics from holding more than one office. So a person would try to get more than one office. They try to get, I'm this in the Dominicans, but I'm also technically a priest of this parish, now I get 2 paychecks. And basically removed that from being able to happen. And reformed the educational requirements for ordination because a lot of these guys are idiots. Session 24 had moral requirements for people wanting high offices for obvious reasons, and changed how ecclesiastical courts worked and when certain penalties could be applied. Oh, it goes on. Section 25, reform the election of religious superiors, because that again was steeped in money and influence and all the rest of it. Reform the ownership of property. Again, more things about abusing property. Banned dueling. That was an interesting one. That was apparently they didn't want that going on anymore. They said that was, they described that as a deceit of Satan. So apparently that was, someone's uncle must have gotten killed in a duel. And then almsgiving indulgences. That was when people talk about the sale of indulgences, what was really going on was they would say, if you give alms, you will receive an indulgence. And then they said, by the way, the church building fund counts as alms. And so that's basically how they got away with the sale of indulgences. And so they just banned almsgiving indulgences in their entirety. Okay, so we're out of Trent now. So let's talk about the implementation. We're going to start talking about some people again. So the first one is Saint Angela de Merzi. She was orphaned. Next each one you can see the time here. I'm doing this in chronological order. So she was orphaned at the age of 10 and moved to Salem, Italy with her uncle, and she became very concerned about the state of education for women. And so kind of a grassroots movement. She started a school for girls there, and for the most part it stayed there in her own town. But in 1535 it got official papal approval, and then the movement kind of exploded. And today there are Ursuline schools for girls on every continent except for Antarctica. So an enormous impact held by that one Catholic laywoman. Next, St. Charles Borromeo. St. Charles Borromeo was a man born into privilege, and he was a nephew of the Pope. And he was given administratorship of the Archdiocese of Milan in 1560. He had a big part in those later parts of the council. The Council of Trent wasn't just one big meeting. Right? It wasn't just this thing took a month. It took years to take place. And they would convene, and then everyone would go their separate ways, and then they would have to come back. So basically, Charles Borromeo, for the last, last dozen or so sessions of the council, he basically said, party at my place, we'll have it here. And so he helped bring the Council of Trent to its completion. He inherited a complete mess up in Milan. There were over 3,000 clergy, which even on Catholic sources described them as decadent, irreverent, corrupt, and ignorant. And that was from Catholic sources. I'm sure it might have been even worse if you'd been there. And so he set to work reforming it and bringing about the reforms that Trent demanded. And so they simplified churches and monuments, so no more, building up the statue in front of your parish to make yours the best one in town. Reformed the education in seminaries. He also started focusing on education for school children. He started what is widely regarded as the first Catholic Sunday school, so I have him to thank, sarcastically. He assisted in writing the Roman Catechism, which is a universal catechism which came out after the Council of Trent. And during all these reforms he was initiating, he encountered a lot of opposition. People don't like it when you start taking away their stuff and upsetting the apple cart, and the Dominicans tried to kill him. Good for them. That's a bright spot in history. But they were unsuccessful. And during a famine in 1571, he personally arranged for the feeding of 3,000 people from his own family's treasury. When the plague broke out in 1576, he stuck around and personally visited homes with the sick and dying. At this point in time, he wrote his last will and testament, fully expecting that he was going to die. But the good Lord gave him some more time. He died in 1584 from an infection on his leg. If you want to imagine what this man is like, he was described as being a very stern man. So I imagine him as, if you ever had someone like a supervisor who's a very good man, very knowledgeable man, but sort of when he enters the room, all joking ceases and everyone goes back to what they were doing. Or you try to crack a joke and he just looks at you. Okay, I'll go back to work. That's who this man was like. But he was also, if he was stern, he was also a profoundly good man. Who, again, you don't go visit the homes of the sick and dying during a plague unless you seriously believe in what you're doing. So next we're going to talk about Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius of Loyola entered into his adulthood as a Spanish soldier, and he's described as being a very ambitious soldier who liked the way that his cape looked as he swished it around. He liked the way that the women looked at him. And he loved the life of a soldier. He wanted to be sort of a soldier superstar. But his erstwhile career was ended by cannonball. Happens to the best of us. And he spent a long time in a hospital where he was on the mend and he had a conversion. The story is that he actually had an apparition of Satan while in prison. The devil apparently appeared to him and scared the hell out of him. And afterwards, he took a trip to the Holy Land, and it was there he got the idea that he wanted to be a soldier, only this time he wanted to be a soldier for Christ through the Pope. And so he went to the University of Alcala, which we mentioned the founding of it earlier, and then he studied in Paris. And he founded, along with some friends, the Society of Jesus, otherwise known as the Jesuits. And so this society was focused on education. It was aimed at serving the Pope by propagating the faith, both in Europe and abroad. So many of the Catholic missionaries that went to Japan or the New World, North America, were Jesuit missionaries. And they would also, of course, they would try to rebut the Protestants. So that was another thing they ended up doing. American colleges founded by the Jesuits include Georgetown, Boston College, Fordham, Marquette, St. Louis University, and Xavier University. So they're incredibly important in the history of American education. Unfortunately, I have to say that during the late 60s, when the American education system basically abandoned the approach of Western civilization, these universities went with it, and these Catholic universities is a good and handy list of which universities not to send your Catholic kids to. It's embarrassing to have to say that, but it's true. Right now at Georgetown, there is a pro-family group, pro-marriage group, which is having to answer some questions before the student activities group because they happen to teach what the church teaches about marriage at a Catholic university. Embarrassing, but true. Teresa of Avila, very, very famous Catholic writer. She entered the Spanish Carmelite convent in 1535. And she was very discontent with the laxity that was going on there. She wanted to restore the Carmelite order to its pristine piety and its pristine devotion, and so she made it. She became the mistress of the convent there, and she started initiating these reforms. And she ended up founding half a dozen other convents, and she convinced many male orders of Carmelites to this male Carmelite, sorry. And convinced many male Carmelite orders to follow her lead. You might wonder, what exactly does a Carmelite do? And it's something that honestly is very tough for me to even get my head around. I have some former students that went into the Carmelite order, and they just pray. That's what they do. They go into a monastery and they pray. For you, for me. It's very, you wonder, why don't they do something for the world? But if you really do believe in the power of prayer, you'd have to believe that, these Carmelite monasteries where these women are just praying constantly for the church and for us is sort of like the engine. It's like the engine room of the great ship, which is the church. It's very hard for me to wrap my mind around. I have to admit to you, it's something I'm honestly uncomfortable with. But that's what they do. They are called to a whole life of prayer. That's what Carmelites do. Teresa of Avila is also famous for giving us a work called The Interior Castle. And what it is sort of her meditation on the stages of development in our spirituality. And so she imagines it using the analogy of a castle that has many mansions inside of it. And so the first step is conversion. It's your obvious first step. And then edification through preaching. So you expose yourself to good and edifying materials like books and lectures. Then living an exemplary life, trying to live an exteriorly outward life which is congruent with what the teachings of Christ are. And then you learn total dependence on God. You learn to stop worrying and to make yourself available to the providence of God. And then after that you find prayerful union with God. Your spiritual prayer life deepens. And then you find joy in suffering, which is, she puts it as the second to last step. It's a very profound thing. The final doorway is through the appreciation of suffering and to meet Christ there. And then finally, she describes the final bridal chamber where you meet the bridegroom Christ who is awaiting you. This imagery, honestly, is probably more friendly to a female audience. Entering into your bridegroom's chambers, for men is like, yeah. But anyways, people have been studying her ever since. One of the male, I mentioned that Teresa of Avila had some influence on some male orders. One of them was the person of John the Cross, who grew up in poverty in Medina del Campo, and he was educated in a Jesuit school back when they were good, and entered the Carmelite religious order for men. And he also, like Teresa of Avila, wanted to reform his order. But as I mentioned, no one likes it when you upset their apple cart. And after he was given control of various communities, tensions arose, and his brothers put him in prison. They put him in a dark prison where he had very little light, and they fed him poorly, and apparently it took him out to beat him, which is what you do when you're a holy man of God, apparently. But anyways, he eventually escaped after 9 months of imprisonment, and he was given several other offices by the end of his life in 1591. But the great fruit of that time in prison, being tormented by his less pious brethren, was he wrote poems in his head. He wrote this poem called The Dark Night and The Ascent of Mount Carmel. It's really one poem. But he wrote a whole work of spiritual reflections where he took this poem that he wrote in his head, and then for each stanza, he would write a long commentary on what that stanza is supposed to mean. And this forms the work known as The Dark Night of the Soul and The Ascent of Mount Carmel. So one stanza of this was, it goes like this. In the happy night, in secret, when no one saw me, nor I beheld aught, without light or guide, save that which burned in my heart, O night that guided me, O night more lovely than dawn, O night that joined beloved to lover, lover transformed into the beloved. This was him meditating on the darkness of his cell as he tried to find Christ in his cell. The dark night of the soul is trying to find your way through times of spiritual dryness and feeling as if God has abandoned you, and trying to find God's closeness to you even through that experience. The final stage of his work was called the spiritual canticle. It's supposed to be what happens when you come out of this dark night of the soul. And it explains the uninhibited growth that you experience when you come out of this. And the quote from that is, "My sole occupation is love. All my occupation now is the practice of the love of God. All the powers of soul and body and memory and understanding and will and interior and exterior senses, the desires of spirit and of sense, all work in and by love. All that I do is love. All that I suffer in the sweetness of love." Next we have St. Francis de Sales, and he studied liberal arts in Paris, and he was ordained in 1593, and was made the provost of Geneva. And understand that at this point in time, Geneva was given over to Calvinist ruling. And so if any of you can remember what it was like during the Cold War, when according to the American government, the official government of China was in Taiwan. I don't know if you guys remember that. the exile of the Chinese government. So you can imagine that. It's a good analogy. It's a useful analogy of what was going on. And so he was made the provost of Geneva, but he was really in Annecy, France. And he was sent there to preach against Calvinism. So my apologies to our second speaker in this lecture series. And he was made Bishop of Geneva, where he was not actually there, in 1602. For any Catholics who are aware, who know Bishop Robert Barron, if you ever benefited from any of his works, he was much like the Bishop Robert Barron of the day. He initiated reform in his diocese there in France, and he had new catechetical instructions. He tried to implement the reforms of Trent. He formed men and women's religious communities and served as a model for austerity and for sound preaching. He was just a really good bishop, and he cared very deeply about the spirituality of his lay people. He died in 1622. His last words were, "God's will be done, Jesus my God and my all." He left behind two works. The first one is an introduction to the devout life. It was written specifically for his Catholic lay people. And it's a very practical manual on Christian living. It has such topics as how to avoid venial sins, which you just can't get yourself away from, how to read Scripture, forming real friendships, and also has marriage advice, which speaks very, very highly of the great calling of marriage. He also wrote, this was more of a theological work, probably not envisioned for lay people, but he wrote a treatise on the love of God, which is a 12-book series on how the love of God interacts with the soul of the believer and how the believer perseveres in love. And our last stop here is St. Vincent de Paul. He was ordained in 1600, and he received a canon law degree in 1604. And his idea was that he was probably one of these clergy that the Council of Trent was writing against. He was one of these careerists who wanted to get the paycheck and retire early and support his family on the largesse of the church. Things went awry when he was sailing one day, and he was taken prisoner by the aforementioned Muslim pirates, and he spent several. Did I write down how long it was? I did not write down how long he was in captivity, but he was in captivity for years. He was a slave, and he was traded several times before he was traded to a former Christian who he was able to convince to. That's obnoxious. He was able to convince this former Christian to convert back to his faith, and when that happened, they both went back to France together. And anyways, he ended up founding. He began work as a priest again in 1607, and this experience of slavery gave him a heart for captives. And he started a mission to ransom slaves, and he established the Daughters of Charity, a charitable organization. And he founded hospitals and homes for the aged and the dying. So this experience in captivity really reformed his life, turned him into a careerist who wanted to retire early, doing as little work as possible, to a man who was utterly spent on the things of God. And so he founded congregations for the education of priests, and served as a spiritual director of a convent of Mary of the Angels, who I believe that served the royalty at the time. So that's me trying to give you an idea of the sort of people at the time of before and after 1517. So let's talk about then and now. A lot has happened since then, for good and for evil. The 16th century shows us many holy men and women who were dedicated to the love of God, who put themselves at great risk for the service of Christ. For bad, during this time we saw a lot of people who were willing to call each other names and not willing to hear each other out. I went back and reread the papal bull that excommunicated Martin Luther, and this was not, a document written by a very charitable man. They were calling Luther names, and this is not anything that you would read and you'd be like, "Oh, I am persuaded by this man's charity." No, it was really not a very friendly or Irenic document. It was not very good. That was on the Catholic side, and other documents only got worse. Then again, if you read some other works at the time, they were calling the Pope the Antichrist, and throughout the Book of Concord, which is the Lutheran document. It refers to Catholics as the adversary, sometimes with a capital A. So there's much to learn from, both for good and bad in this period of time. And I think that as Christians, we would do well to remember Philippians 2:3, let nothing be done through strife or pride, but in lowliness of mind, esteem everyone as better than yourself. Very important words in Romans chapter 12, verse 10. Be devoted to one another in love, honor one another above yourselves. And I wish that more people in the 15th and 16th and 17th century would have followed that advice. Perhaps things would have not have ended as they did. Since then, on the Catholic side of things, the relationship has changed remarkably. Before the Second Vatican Council, in Boston, there was a Father, Leonard Feeney, who tried to teach that only card-carrying Catholics could possibly be saved. That you have to be a member of a diocese and you have to be going to church to be saved. So he basically wrote off all non-Catholics. He was censured by the Vatican in 1949. He was told that, no, we don't actually believe that. And the Second Vatican Council, it clarified what we actually believe about non-Catholics and said, all who have been justified by faith in baptism are members of Christ's body and have the right to be called Christian, and so are correctly accepted as brothers by the children of the Catholic Church. Another thing which has happened is what Chuck Colson called the ecumenism of the trenches. We live in a very different society. When I was in high school, a lot of this new atheism stuff had not yet broken out. And so when we went to Bible study, we were asking a lot of questions that we would be getting from our non-Catholic neighbors. We were asking, Pastor so-and-so, well, how do we answer this? How do we answer this? These days, being in that position of the youth minister, I would love to get some of those questions every now and then, because you could actually open up the Bible and start talking turkey about Christian theology. But my students, day in, day out, are confronted by the new atheism and confronted by, the redefinition of marriage and abortion and stuff like that. And I've given talks to groups of non-Catholics as well, because, as Peter Crave, Boston College professor Peter Crave says, feuding brothers unite when there's a madman at the door. And that's what we find ourselves going on right now. There is a madman at the door in the form of the secular culture, and we are forced to confront it together. And so certain differences that we have we have to put them in perspective when we're confronted by a person who says that God isn't real and we need to do all this stuff. There was a joint declaration of justification between, initially it was the World Lutheran Synod and the Catholic Church, but since then a Methodist group and I think there was a Presbyterian group that joined as well. Basically talking about the common ground that we have in terms of the doctrine of justification. Some people will talk it up as if all issues were clarified and that all things were agreed upon at the conclusion of that. Really, that's not the case, but it does have there is a firm footing that points out that we do share in common. Oh, there it is. The Catholic Church, the Lutheran World Federation, and the World Methodist Council, and the World Communion of Reformed Churches. Okay, I put that on the slide. I showed them watching my presentation there. So there's been a lot of signs of progress in terms of Catholic and non-Catholic communication. It's good that we're talking again. Because we are called to unity. We are called to be one in Christ. That is what He desires. That's what we pray for. We are indeed called, despite any differences, to live out what Christ said at the Last Supper. I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe on me through their word, that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me. That's the conclusion of my presentation. I thank you guys very much for your attention.
Thank you. I've learned a lot as the Protestant pastor here today. I've learned a lot in my own training, though. I did study the Counter-Reformation in the Roman Catholic Church, and I grew to appreciate some of the basic things that were shared here, but I learned a lot of other things also. Any questions that have come to surface in your own mind that you would like to ask our brother Stephen McKee?
In the back.
I'm wondering, is there a rescinding of a excommunication? Have they ever, did a pope ever consider rescinding the excommunication of Luther?
So, the answer there is no. So, at the Council of Trent, if you read the canons, it says, if you saith such and such thing, anathema, right? And at that point in time, anathema referred to a formal excommunication. There was a ceremony involved, and it basically meant that it's a canonical penalty which can only be applied to Catholics, right? So if you're not Catholic, you can't be excommunicated by the Catholic Church. It would be like the country of Canada sending me a letter of deportation. I'd be like, what? So the canonical penalties attached to a Catholic who tries to preach those things would still stand. So if I became a Catholic professor and I went to the University of Steubenville and I started preaching against the things in the Council of Trent, they very well could excommunicate me. They could send me a letter in the mail that says, yep, stop it, right? And if I refuse, I could very well be excommunicated. And so, there's no sense in de-excommunicating a person after they're dead, because they've met a much higher authority, and that's been sorted out. So, and so there's really no practical reason to do so, and those canonical penalties still apply. But it's important to realize they apply to Catholics. If you are not Catholic, again, it would be like the country of Canada trying to deport you. I hope that addresses your question.
Does the Catholic Church maybe recognize that Luther was the impetus that started or maybe brought those reforms about in the Catholic Church?
Well, the last three popes have had much more glowing things to say about Martin Luther. So they'll say that he was a man very concerned about the gospel, and they'll try to praise him on those things which we share in common. Sometimes, as a Catholic, a person will approach you and say, well, it was Martin Luther who really was the impetus for making, your reform possible. So you really ought to be thanking the man. And here's an analogy for that. Imagine there is a man who is estranged from his wife, and their son dies, and he meets up his wife at the funeral, and they reconcile. Okay, so something good has come out of this. Something good has come out of this. But then imagine at the dinner table, someone says to him, "Aren't you glad your son died, so the two of you get back together?" You're not going to say yes to that question. And so if a person says, "Aren't you glad Luther did what he did so the church could finally work its way up to reforming the way it did?" I'm like, I would have preferred it happen without that. A lot of harm came out of that. And I am glad that God writes straight with crooked lines. I'm glad for the good that came out of it. But I'm not going to be grateful for the bad things that came out of it. Does that address your question?
Yeah.
Of Jerusalem. And so there's always things afoot. There's always things that need to be addressed. The most recent of which, I was in sophomore year in high school during this time, but everyone is familiar with the sex abuse crisis that happened in the Catholic Church. There's been enormous reform since then. Working in Catholic youth ministry, I have to live that out every time I meet. I mean, there's all kinds of rules. We have to get retrained every single year on this matter. And so there's always need because the church is staffed 100% by sinners. And so there's always going to be needs to reform things. I mean, if I could initiate a reform, I would actually reform the Roman collar. I would actually put little buzzers in there so that if they give a homily that's nothing but funny family stories, they would just start. And it would make them more and more uncomfortable until they would start actually commenting on the readings like they're supposed to. That's what I think about sometimes. I'm usually in the back of the church walking around my baby, and if the homily goes 5 minutes in and he's still there in the family stories, I'm like, okay, come on. And then it might end without ever getting to the gospel. I'm like, yeah, a little buzz right. Anyways, yeah. So there's always reforms going on because the church is full of sinners, like me. So. Oh, yes, sir. And I recognize you from last week. Yes, sir.
Stephen, just wonderful group of reformers, and you had to limit yourself. I wish we had another week that you could talk from 1700 to the present. But just pick one or two persons that you admire who has been a more recent reformer than the ones that you talked about.
Okay. Personal hero of mine is Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen.
My bishop.
I named my second son after him, and he was the first Christian televangelist. He was the first one to make it to television, and if you've seen some of them today, the quality has gone down in some quarters. He would get up there and he would be talking about really deep theology on national television. He won Emmys for this. And he would get up there unapologetically with this big purple cape, and he would swish it around. I remember watching reruns of his in black and white in my parents' basement, and I had never heard a man speak the way this man did. He was amazing, and so my wife bought me a full copy of his audio recordings, and I've listened to them on the way to work and so on. And enormous impact that man has had on my life, and his first miracle got approved, actually, earlier this year. There was a baby in Peoria, Illinois, a few years back, who was born with the umbilical cord strangled to death during the birth. The baby was dead. And that baby was a corpse for 61 minutes. 61 minutes a corpse. And the people there, the parents, loved Fulton J. Sheen. And so they asked for Fulton J. Sheen's intercession. And they asked for him to, he's in heaven, do something! You're next to God. Tell him to do something. And the baby, after 61 minutes of being a corpse, was resuscitated back to life. Just came back. So today, I think that by now he's a 5-year-old bouncing baby boy who was a corpse for 61 minutes and came back. That is Archbishop Fulton Sheen's first confirmed miracle. So I love that guy. I guess another reformer who's a hero of mine recently would probably be Pope Benedict, who reformed the Catholic liturgy to try to bring some more reverence back to it. He was also this very insightful theologian. His work is, it's not difficult. It's not a great gushing stream from which you can only get a little bit, and from that only a small extract that you can get. It's a very slow, plodding stream of thought, which is very clear and very honest. People think of Pope Benedict as being a very mean man because he is physically ugly. I mean, he just is. All right. So he doesn't have a good camera presence, but man, his writing is so deep and penetrating and honest, and so I love him very much as well.
Others? We have time for one more. Yes?
I don't know whether to ask this, but why is there a separate Catholic Holy Bible
As opposed to the one that
As to-
non-Catholics use?
as opposed to the Holy Bible? Why is it? What's special about it?
So one of the controversies that came about in the Reformation period is what books shall belong in our Bible. And if you were to go back earlier to the Fourth Council of Florence in the 1440s, you would find that they talk about a list of books that belongs in the Bible, and it is the same one that would be in a Catholic Bible today. But at the time, people were asking Martin Luther, they said to him, well, you deny the existence of purgatory. What about this here in the book of Maccabees? He says, well, the book of Maccabees isn't truly canon. And so what happened is there were 7 books, which Luther regarded them as not fully canonical, but he still kept them in his Bible, kind of in an appendix. He said they were good for reading, but they weren't truly the inspired word. And so for a period of, so I believe he even translated them in his German translation of the Bible. But what that started was two divergent streams of two different table of contents being used. The Catholic Church continued to use the one, which had St. Augustine's canon back in the year 390 or so. St. Augustine wrote about what the canon of Scripture was. And since then, we've been using the same one ever since then. But at that point of time, a new canon emerged, which was a Protestant canon. What happened was those deuterocanonical books, those 7, were basically held in an appendix. But then after a certain point, when the printing press was invented, and people, actually it already was invented, when they started mass producing these things to save ink and space, they said, well, why are we including these uninspired books? And they tossed them out. And that's why the non-Catholics in this room would be using a 63-book Bible, and Catholics would be using a 66-book Bible, and we Catholics would be using a 73-book Bible. But that's why there's differences there. It's in the Old Testament, 7 books, and parts of Daniel. So that's where that comes from.